With all these new pilots being needed, what impact is that going to have on climate change? Like, what does it mean to train a whole new generation of pilots in the middle of a climate emergency? Well, George Hibberd, who's my next guest, is a former commercial pilot who left the cockpit 3 years in a row over concerns about aviation's environmental impact. He now works with an organisation called Safe Landing, a group of aviation workers pushing for a more sustainable future for the industry. And I spoke to George a little earlier and began by asking how he views the pilot shortage and whether the industry's growth plans are really compatible with climate goals.
I'm now part of a global community of aviation workers that want to live in a world where aviation flourishes in harmony with nature. And this compromise, this balance that we have to find for training more workers, expanding the industry, but also trying to balance that with the obligations, both morally and scientifically, to tackle the emissions of aviation is a really tough balance to strike. What we say in Safe Landing is that the industry is expanding possibly in the wrong direction, expanding with fossil fuel infrastructure, fossil fuel aircraft, and fossil fuel trained pilots is perhaps the wrong direction to go in. And instead, we should be focusing our efforts and our research, our development, our innovation, and our funding towards technologies of the future that are going to enable our industry to thrive for generations to come, not just for the next 5, 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of airlines do talk about things like sustainable aviation fuels and, zero emission plane. I mean, are we sort of pinning too much hope on tech that could perhaps still be years away realistically?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a lot of the sustainability pathways that airlines and governments are currently setting out are extremely high risk. A lot of them focus on technology that's not yet really proven, things like hydrogen electric. A lot of pathways rely on carbon capture and removals, again, which has not been proven at scale. And to us, as an aviation workers perspective, this is really high risk. If this was a flight and the emergency alarms were going off, we wouldn't just ignore them and hope for the best. We would put in place a plan that is completely scientifically proven and is as low risk as possible, because ultimately it's going to be aviation workers, air traffic controllers, cabin crew, flight crew that are going to be impacted by whether our industry can decarbonize quick enough to, one, avoid climate collapse and eventually societal collapse, but also panics climate legislation. We're set to bust through 1.5 degrees, our Paris Agreement. If that happens, we could have panicked climate legislation, which makes aviation fall off a cliff. And a lot of the investment that's currently going into fossil fuel expansion could become stranded assets. And that's something we really want to avoid.
I mean, you left flying, you left your career as a pilot because of climate anxiety. How do you think young pilots today are grappling with that same conflict? Is it quite common?
When I was working in the airline that I worked for, you're in a flight deck with another person for the best part of 10 hours. So you talk about all sorts of things. And inevitably, we talked about climate change a lot. And what I found was that most pilots understand that the climate is breaking down. Our industry needs to do more. And increasingly, especially younger pilots, pilots with much more stake in the industry because they're at the start of their careers and they're perhaps just starting a family, they're quite concerned about the direction the industry is going. So they want the industry to do more. So they're crying out for an ability, for a way to make sure our industry is fit for the future. And a way that we see that we can do that in Safe Landing is by empowering workers, grassroots workers, with a form of deliberative participatory democracy that we've been pioneering in Safe Landing called workers' assemblies, whereby you get workers from all around the industry to come together, listen to the climate science, listen to all the different stakeholders and the possible pathways forward, and then come together to decide, what do we want as aviation workers? How do we preserve this beautiful industry that we've built over many decades now? How do we preserve that for generations to come?
And then when you see reports out like this one from Oliver Winman showing that the Middle East region will be the only region where demand for pilot continues to significantly outpace the supply through the next 10 years, with an estimated need for 10,000 more pilots by 2030. What's your reaction?
My reaction is, should we be going in that direction? Should we be increasing demand for fossil fuel powered aircraft? And my answer would be no, I don't think we should. I think we can and should be creating jobs in research, development, innovation to bring forward some of those future technologies that haven't quite yet been scaled. They're not quite yet price competitive. We have a lot of expertise in the industry, a lot of jobs, a lot of skills and professions that can be pumped into this research and innovation. But currently, we're still going in the direction of more fossil fuel aircraft. So we can create jobs, we can create prosperity, but we need to be on a much more sustainable flight path.
Do you think it could be time we questioned kind of the idea of aviation continuing to expand? This it just seems like it goes from strength to strength. Or, is there perhaps a middle ground between perhaps reducing the number of flights that airlines put out, reducing the number of staff they employ subsequently, compared to this endless expansion?
Well, fundamentally, we can't negotiate with the atmosphere. We can't negotiate with the climate crisis. It won't let us do that. It doesn't listen to unions. It doesn't listen to governments. We need to have a really adult conversation as an industry. How do we want to move forwards, given the state of the climate, given the state of economies around the world? I think the best way that we can do that is to give aviation workers a voice in that conversation, because ultimately it will be us that is going to be impacted by it first. Not to mention the Middle East, in particular, Middle East, Africa, will be impacted predominantly by the worsening droughts, worsening wildfires. So aviation workers really need to have a say in which direction we go in.
That was the voice there of George Hibberd, who is a former commercial pilot who now campaigns for a climate responsible aviation industry through a worker-led group called Safe Landing.